CAPSA is co-convened by Jesuit Social Services and Jesuit Refugee Service. And each year we hold the National Week of Prayer and Action. This year it runs from 4th to 8th of September, with our theme being Freedom to Live for Refugees and People Seeking Asylum. So our webinar this year will be through a discussion panel with some fantastic panelists today. And they'll be exploring this theme, Freedom to Live, but they will also be discussing some of the issues that refugees are facing at the moment in Australia, but also globally, and what we as a community can do in advocating and taking action. There will be an opportunity for a Q&A, which will be towards the end of our session, and you can ask any questions through our live Zoom chat during that time. Before going any further, just some housekeeping for today. As I mentioned, this is a live event and it is being recorded. It is being recorded right now. We will also be sending out a copy of that recording when it is done in the coming days. This webinar runs for 1.5 hours from 4:30 to 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. If you could please leave your cameras on and also your microphones on mute if possible with the cameras, that would be great. You can enable and disable that in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, both the microphone as well as the camera. We will be monitoring this live chat throughout the session. If you have any kind of questions, comments, tech issues, please put that in our chat and we will do our best to respond to you as quickly as we can. And as well as the Q&A right at the end, we'll have some designated time for you to put in the live chat. If we are unable to respond to your questions directly during the Q&A, we will try and respond later after the session in the coming days via email. The event will also be closed captioned, and any kind of errors or mistakes from the closed caption we will also be responding to on the live chat. Now, to start things off, I would like to pass things over to Father Andrew Hamilton, who's been a long-time supporter of CAPSA, and he will be leading us on a prayer and reflection.
Thanks very much for your work in organising this great event, Rahel. The theme of freedom to live reminds me of the time when refugees became personal to me. It was in a camp at the Thai border holding refugees from Pol Pot's Cambodia. Their desire for freedom, free to live decent lives, free from fear, and free to build, affected me deeply. It was caught in a poem. I'll read that then. Adults pass gutters by. They hold the tatty bags from Thursday's rice and bamboo scraps made pink with dust that bides its time. To children, rubbish is the stuff of dreams. They split and tease bamboo, bind it to a plastic sheet, then crimp a fringe, tease its tail, and run until their kite defies its gutter origins. Like air materialized, it jumps and dips, tugs at its restraining string, and flies away. God knows how, God knows where. The poem catches two sides of the lives of refugees. The first is the gutters, into which fate has dumped their past life like rubbish. There lie all they have built, their day-to-day relationships, their place in their community, and their hope for a peaceful life. Now others see them as rubbish. They are not persons, but things to be used by guides who promise a new rich life, by governments that use them as a buffer against their neighbours, by people who see them as a market, and by security forces who see them as a threat to be deterred. For refugees, the gutters run with bitter memories of former blessings, and more recent curse. Yet their children live only in the present. Their kites embody the desire of refugees to rise above the burdens of the past, to be free to pass through fences and locked gates, to be free of fear, free to raise a family, to study, to plan their life's work, to be reunited with family, to own and to be owned by a town, a state, a nation. These hopes feed their resilience. So freedom to live is so much more than not being killed. It is about dreams, about agency, about gift, about community. It is about building a kite and letting it fly. These large hopes underlie the practical issues we shall discuss today. They are also the stuff of the gospel. Let me finish with a brief prayer. Loving God, we pray for people forced from their homes and lands. May they be free to live full and rich lives with open doors. May they find us just and hospitable. We make this prayer through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you so much, Father Andy, for your prayer and your reflection and your insights. Really appreciate it, and I think a really great way to start our session today. So with that, I would now like to introduce to you all our chair and moderator for this afternoon, Julie Edwards. So Julie is the CEO of Jesuit Social Services, and she is also the co-chair of CAPSA. Julie has worked for Jesuit Social Services for 22 years and has overseen CAPSA since its beginning stages from 2013 as well. Julie has extensive experience in working with and engaging with marginalised people and people experiencing systemic and significant disadvantage over the past 40 years, including working alongside refugees and people seeking asylum.
Thanks, Rahel, and thanks, Andy. It is National Week of Prayer and Action, so it was very fitting to start today's webinar with prayer. We're going to be exploring also what action might look like in terms of accompanying people, refugees and people seeking asylum, so that they can have the freedom to live. And also we'll be opening it up to the audience for question and answer. So you might like to think about that as we move to that part of the day. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands we're zooming in from for this webinar. Pay my respects to their elders, past and present, acknowledge that there may be other Aboriginal people here with us on the Zoom. And I begin by acknowledging just the important time that this is for our nation, and particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and for us to be good allies at this time. So that's the context, or the foundation, I suppose, from which we move forward now to this webinar. We're very fortunate that we have an expert panel, or panel of experts, with differing expertise, including lived experience, that we'll be drawing on today, and that you'll have an opportunity to ask people about as well. So I think we might move straight to introductions. And first I'll ask Sarah, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, absolutely. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me here today. I'd like to pay my respect to the traditional owners of the land. My name is Sarah Musamel. I was born and raised in Sudan prior moving to the US as a refugee. While in the US, I did my undergrad in political science, and I did my master's in international relations. and I've been working in the field of human rights for over 12 years now, in particular, refugee service. I am very passionate about human rights, and again, in particular, young girls and women rights. I have worked in the prevention of the practice of female genital mutilation. And since coming to Australia, I have worked now for JRS as a gender-based violence specialist caseworker. My title has changed recently to the Finding Safety Project officer. So I work with women seeking asylum and women on temporary visas who have experienced gender-based violence. And when I talk about gender-based violence, I mean not only domestic violence, but it's also important to know that domestic violence has no borders. As we all know, it happens in all countries, in all cultures, all religion backgrounds, all socioeconomic backgrounds. So the women we work with experience domestic violence, early marriage, forced marriage, dowry abuse, trafficking, modern slavery, as well as female genital mutilation and something called breast ironing. So we work with these women, we accompany them, we serve them, and we advocate on their behalves. So this is me. Thank you.
That's great, Sarah. Thanks for that introduction, and by teasing out a little bit your experience and your priority areas that you work in, you've stimulated our thinking so that I'm sure there'll be questions being prepared to ask you later. So thanks for that. Zaki, I'll ask you next to introduce yourself, please.
Hi, good evening. My name is Zaki Haidari, and I would like to acknowledge that I'm dialing in from the Darug land. And I would like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Thank you for having me today. I am the refugee rights campaigner at Amnesty International Australia, and my work is quite broad when it comes to the refugee rights. But I am also a Hazara refugee from Afghanistan, and I have been living in this country for the past almost 11 years now on different sort of temporary protection visa. I have lived with very limited rights in this country. I was told that I was not welcome here. And today I am a permanent resident of this country after 11 years. But I have also lost a lot of close friends during these harsh policies that Australian politicians been playing up with people's life. It's also heartbreaking for me that in today's age, or in Australian democracy, we still do not respect the rights of asylum seekers. As we speak here, we gather together. There are thousands of people with no or very limited basic human rights in Australia. We have people seeking asylum on bridging visas that are not allowed to study, that are not allowed to continue build their lives, that are not allowed to work. So the system is still failing to protect those that are coming to seek asylum and to seek protection from this country. And yet we close our doors when it comes to humanity, when it comes to people that are seeking asylum, when it comes to people that are fleeing persecution, violence, and war and conflict, countries like Afghanistan. We do have a humanitarian intake per year, but it's not enough to respond to the current crisis that is unfolding around the world. So one of the key areas that I work is that if Australia closes its humanity to those that are seeking asylum, instead we should have a larger intake of refugees so we could respond to the current crisis. That's also my work as well. But also I'm here tonight or today to discuss what does freedom look like for people like myself and my friends that are still living on horrible temporary visas. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaki, and again for that full introduction about yourself and the sharing of your own lived experience, which will be really valuable today. Thank you. Ben, could I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for the invitation to speak. I'm on Gadigal land. My name is Ben Doherty. I'm a journalist with The Guardian newspaper, and I've been in this country probably the best part of a decade now, writing on issues around immigration, in particular around asylum and refugees. I had a particular focus on offshore processing and offshore detention when those regimes were in place on Nauru and Manus. I think I went to Manus 4 times for my reportage, but also I've done significant reporting around the rights and lives of refugees and asylum seekers living in Australia, as Zaki talked about, the privations and the difficulties of living on temporary protection visas, and the ongoing difficulties that still exist. And I think Zaki makes a really important point that these are ongoing issues that we are confronting right now. There are thousands of people living in this country right now who have less than full civic rights in this country because of their migration status. There are 75 men at the moment held in Port Moresby who still remain held in PNG despite offshore processing ostensibly ending in that country. So this remains an issue in Australia, perhaps not as prominent as it once was in terms of the media cycle, but one that still requires a great deal of public attention. So I think today's event and this week's events are really valuable to refocus attention on this issue.
Thanks very much, Ben. We look forward to hearing more from you about the reporting and also the advocacy that you've been doing for so long now. And our final panellist is Tamara. Tamara, will you introduce yourself, please?
Thanks very much, Julie. Yes, my name's Tamara Domisel, and I'm dialing in from Darug and Gundungurra country and pay my deep respect to elders past and present. It's my privilege to be the country director of the Jesuit Refugee Service, JRS, in Australia, and the co-chair of CAPSA, along with Julie. Australia is one of about 58 countries in which JRS accompanies, serves and advocates for and with refugees, people seeking asylum, others who've been displaced, and migrants in situations of vulnerability. I've worked in the fields of refugee protection and forced migration for about 25 years now in a range of policy, advocacy, executive and frontline management roles, including engaging in UN dialogues and processes as a representative of the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network, most recently in relation to the development and rollout of the Global Compact for refugees and the Global Compact on safe, orderly and regular migration. And I've worked across various organisations in Australia, including Act for Peace, the Asylum Seekers Centre, the Human Rights Commission, Refugee Council and Oxfam. I just say that it's a real privilege to be sharing the floor with such exceptional colleagues. So Sarah, Zaki, Ben, Father Andy and Julie, all of whom have made really tremendous contributions to strengthening protection and freedom for refugees and people seeking asylum over countless years here in Australia and elsewhere. And thank you to everyone online for choosing to demonstrate your solidarity with displaced people through your presence and engagement this evening, and for the many gifts which we know you already bestow: donation of funds and food, time and talent, deep listening, hospitality, prayer. I won't add to the various observations that my co-panelists have already made just now. I'll reserve that for later, but I wholeheartedly affirm everything that's already been said. Thank you.
Thanks, Tamara. So I think, audience, you'll agree we have a very wonderful panel, and I think in for a rich discussion. So look, I'll go to our first question, and Sarah, I'll start with you. I'd like to hear your reflections on what do you think it means to be able to live with freedom? Any reflections that you bring from your work, from your lived experience about what it means to be able to live in freedom? You need to unmute, Sarah.
Sorry about that. Well, thanks, Judy. That's a big question, but freedom to live, to me, I'd like to envision it as an upside down pyramid where the top is the ability to pursue happiness. The bottom of it, the pointing bottom of the pyramid, the upside down one, is the basic human needs. So like, you know, basic food, shelter, adequate health, safety from war, safety from persecution, safety from discrimination. And of course, we can throw in a lot of things, but to me, freedom to live is to be able to pursue my happiness. I also want to talk about what it means to the women that I work with. And to them, I've heard it time and time and time again. They told me that we just want to be treated equal. We are also human beings, and all they want is to be treated equal.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. You finished, Sarah?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah,
yes.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's listening to you, the very topic, in a way, not so much strikes me as strange, but that we almost have to focus on it. It's the fact that what does it mean to be able to live in freedom? It feels such a fundamental human right. And yet here we are discussing, gee, what does that mean? So Zaki, I'm just going to go to you next. As you said, you know, the cruelty continues in many ways. So what are your reflections on what it means to be able to live in freedom?
Thank you, Jill. I think as someone who is forced to leave their country or forced to, you know, take places that you don't normally would want to go, just to find safety and protection, and just to be yourself. For example, in my case, being a Hazara, and today Afghanistan is itself a crime, and being Hazara is, you know, a level of being targeted by the Taliban, which they, you know, have massacred my people just because of our look and our ethnicity. But just being a normal human being, where you can, you know, you can be yourself, you can be a normal human being where you share the same value with other people. However, in Australia's refugee and asylum policies, that protection and freedom has not been in place, at least in the past 20 years. We, as a country, we have taken people's freedom instead of giving them that freedom that any human being deserves. For example, we have pushed back asylum seekers to the danger, for example, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Thailand, PNG, Nauru. These are normal human beings who were just searching for their freedom and being in a safe country where they can be just themselves. However, that brutality and that you know, cruelty has continued on people in our country. For example, keeping people on temporary visa, not allowing them to study, not allowing them to work, and not allowing them to learn English. When I arrived here, I was forced to stay home for 3 years. That's 3 years with no access to education, with not access to work. I did not have work rights. I was forced to stay home for 3 years. You know, that's a long time. That's if we have taken that freedom and dignity away from those that are coming here to seek asylum. I think the system and people in power in Parliament House has to respond to what they have taken away from people. As of today, we have fathers and mothers that have been away from their families for 10 years or more just because of this cruelty. You know, freedom means being safe, being yourself, being with your family, care for each other. And I think this cruelty by politicians has divided us as a nation, has divided us as a human being. I think we are going to the right direction where TPV and CHEF is going away. Instead of that, people are getting their permanent protection. But that 10 years, you know, of torturing people will not go away from people and from their memory. The time that they could have spent with their loved ones has gone now. I think the people in power has to respond to what they've taken away from people seeking asylum and refugees. So I think being an asylum seeker or being a refugee, freedom means, live the way you want to live, be with your family, care for your loved ones. And I think that hasn't happened in the past 10 years to thousands of people in this country. And I do hope, with this recent changes, that will come back. The humanity should come back, where people could be themselves, where people could take care of their loved ones and live with dignity, live with their basic human rights.
Thanks very much, Zaki. And once again, I'm struck by the simple and ordinary things that both Sarah and you have shared, about happiness, safety, to be able to live with your family, take care of your family, study, work, all of these things. It really shines a light, I think, on the absence of those things and the cruelty of that. Ben, I'm going to ask you too about your reflections on freedom to live, but perhaps I could ask you to sharpen your focus a little bit more on what some of us might take for granted in this country, people who've lived here all their lives or whatever, and maybe haven't completely tuned into the sorts of things that we take for granted in terms of freedom to live, and that may not be available or aren't available to many people who are refugees and people seeking asylum. So your reflections on what it is, but also sharpen the focus for us, please, on what people are actually, where they're not getting the freedom to live.
It's very funny you should ask those questions, because my mind was going down that path, and I don't know that I could reflect on those things as eloquently as Sarah and Zaki have. But as they were talking, I found myself reworking Donald Trump's "Make America Great Again" into "Make Australia Empathetic Again," and I think that's a really interesting point about an empathy and understanding about how other people are being forced to live their lives in the current situation. And it is a really useful thing, I think, for those of us who are fortunate enough to have that sort of full panoply of civic rights, to imagine what it's like to have them taken away. And you can go back and take it right back to that very basic, the freedom of movement, the freedom to go around, people held in offshore detention, people who are languishing in immigration detention right now, just the simple freedom to go outside, to walk down the street, to meet with who you want to meet with. Those very basic freedoms are being restricted daily. And for some people, not just for a few weeks or a few months, but I'm aware, and Zaki's aware, and I think everyone on this call would be aware that there are people we know who have been in immigration detention for more than a decade, which is an extraordinary thing for a liberal democracy to do, to detain people for that long. There are those fundamental rights, access to healthcare, physical and mental healthcare, to housing, to welfare support. The right to work, feels a really fundamental thing, but that right to work and to support yourself and to feel part of a community through that is vital. Zaki and I have worked together on issues around study rights for asylum seekers and refugees in this country, and that is a kind of, if we're talking a kind of Maslow's hierarchy sort of way, that's a higher order freedom, but it's a really profound and really fundamental freedom. That freedom to fulfill your potential, to express the potential that you have, and the fact that that's being cut short for so many people. And I remember meeting Zaki, close to a decade ago, and talking to him about the frustrations he felt that he wasn't. This was a man who valued education so much and wanted to develop himself and his mind as to its full potential, and that was being held back by a kind of simple stroke of a bureaucratic pen. Those sorts of curtailments of freedom are hugely damaging, particularly when, as Zaki and Sarah have said, they're indefinite and they're seen to be arbitrary, and they're simply bureaucratic. And I mean, there are lots of people on this call who'll be very fortunate to have Australian passports in their back pocket, and I'm very lucky to have one of those. And for us, the idea of moving around the world now that that the COVID pandemic, which was a really useful thought experiment in lots of ways, to know what it's like to be restricted, to not be able to travel, because usually for a lot of people on this call, that movement is just the most easy thing in the world. But for so many millions of people in the world, movement, that freedom of movement is severely curtailed. There is this, and it's an awful term, but there is this sort of global apartheid of people who are allowed to move and able to move freely and people who are not. And it's deeply unjust and deeply unfair, and something that I think we all ought reflect upon.
Thanks very much. We're kind of scoping, you know, what it means, the freedom to live, you know, from perhaps home countries in terms of, you know, safety, etc., to be able to live free from that kind of suffering. But we're also bringing it here now to a country where you'd hope we would be offering the kind of freedom and rights to everyone, where in a sense that suffering and struggle continues. So we're painting a picture of from place of origin to here. And I have a granddaughter coming in here while I just do this. She's gone again in fear when she saw the Zoom. Tamara, before we move on to the next question, are you able to say anything? Do you want to add anything to what this freedom to live means? Any reflections from your point of view?
Thanks, Julie. Yes, look, I would, and just to comment that I think my son might be about to enter as well. But look, I mean, I think, you know, it can mean so many things, freedom to live, but I think at essence, it's about freedom to move beyond surviving to thriving, freedom to attain and to exercise all of the rights which one is owed by virtue of being human. And I think that's been stated very clearly by all of the other panelists, and specifically amongst that, the right to international protection whenever and wherever that's required, which means once you've made it to a border, that you are granted passage, that you are granted the opportunity to seek asylum, that you are welcomed and that you are received with compassion and the integrity of a country honouring its international obligations. I think it's the freedom to speak one's truths when and as one wishes, and to have those truths heard and respected and learned from by the wider society. The freedom to exercise agency, unobstructed in determining one's life's path. So much mention of deliberate obstacles placed in order to obstruct people's capacity to exercise agency. Freedom to contribute the expertise of one's lived experience as a central consideration in all matters by which you're affected. It's a really well-established principle, which we know from experience, that in order to be effective, policies, programs, key decisions really must be informed by the voices and the expertise of people with lived experience who will be most affected by them. And of course, that's a matter of great pertinence to our nation right now. You know, along with inclusion, truth-telling, and truth-hearing, it can only contribute to building a future, in Jesuit terms, of right relationships and reconciliation. I just wanted to cite one particular thing. Most of the team at JRS Australia have lived or living experience of displacement. Recently, one of our team was recognised as a refugee on appeal following a really arduous process. And we're celebrating that with great joy. And with the changed visa status come new freedoms to seek to reunite with family, to pursue dreams unfettered. And another team member, although recognised as a refugee, does not have those freedoms due to the timing and mode of arrival to Australia. So that is a choice that Australia has made. As human beings, we are all owed the same rights, and we should all hold the same freedoms. There's a gaping chasm between us at the moment, and that must be rectified urgently. Thanks.
Thanks, Tamara. Just building on what we've heard to date, I'm thinking about emerging challenges, or perhaps challenges that are going to be enhanced. Wrong word, because I really mean the opposite, but you know, becoming more disastrous. And I'm thinking about things like ongoing conflict in the world. I'm thinking about new forms of violence. There's the traditional wars, etc. But we've heard about more about trafficking of people for organs. There's a range of things. There's climate-induced displacement. And for those who actually perhaps are in a country like Australia, increased cost of living pressures, etc. So there are a range of challenges that we've already experienced, but I'd love to get people on the panel's perception of where do you think all this is going? Like, what do you think might be, what are the challenges either now or into the future that you think we maybe need to wake up to right now and tune into? Maybe I'll alter, I would love to hear from all of you. Zaki, is it okay if I start with you on that one? So just from your experience, what can you sort of see on the horizon?
I think we are living with challenges, and I think a lot of people have moved on, having the Labour Party and the government saying that the issues with refugees has been resolved, and they have made some right decisions, which we do welcome. However, they still follow the same cruelty that the previous government, the coalition government, have been following for the past at least a decade, and that includes the Labour Party as well. I think we are living with challenges. We have about 19,000 on on TPV and SHEF, which half of them potentially have moved on to a permanent visa. We have about 9,000 or more people seeking asylum, which again the system have failed to them, and they're just going through the legal challenges because there was no support provided to them when they were lodging their application for protection. So they still remain a large portion of the refugee policy that the government has to resolve and provide them with a fair process so they can, go through the system and get their refugee status recognized, could move on with their life. And these are people that have been living here for 10 years. We still have 75 people in PNG, as Ben mentioned before. That's a big question for us as an Australian citizen on what's the government plan. How long can we wait for these people to stay there? I think we need to ask a serious question from our politicians, in particular our MPs that are representing us in the House or in the Parliament, on what is your plan? Do we wait for these people, to vanish? How long they should suffer in this isolated country, away from their families, away from their loved ones, with very basic human rights? And that cohort of asylum seeker, again, exists in our community. We have about 600 plus asylum seekers that were detained either in Nauru or PNG. The government does not have solution for them. They keep them on bridging visas forever. And the bridging visas are only for 6 months. So that loop goes on and on and on every 6 months. The trauma and experience that comes with it is just damaging people. We don't know what will happen to these people because the government does not have a clear solution. So that is the challenges that we are living with. In a bigger picture, I think we are living in a region where we have the highest number of displaced people. We have had recent crises in Afghanistan where, if not millions, thousands of refugees are fleeing Afghanistan to neighboring countries, for example, Iran, Pakistan, where they don't have their basic human rights. Most of them are forced to be deported back to Afghanistan to danger where they flee at first or initially. We have over 1 million Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh in a horrible condition in a refugee camp, and not many countries are taking them because they're in our region. I think Australia should play a leadership in responding to the crises that are already happening in the region. So other countries should follow what we're doing in our region. If we don't take those people who are displaced, I don't think many countries will be interested in responding to our crisis, basically the region, Asia and Pacific. So I think if we don't respond, people will be desperate, and we will have people flying, coming in to seek asylum by boat. If we don't increase our humanitarian intake, if we don't respond to this crisis that are unfolding in our region.
Thanks very much, Zaki. And you're really sharpening our focus on the current and existing and ongoing situation that we've just maybe not more than tinkered, but we've shifted a few things, but we really haven't addressed some of the core fundamental parts of the problem that we need to. So thanks for that. We might come back to that. Sarah, I'm going to go to you next about what you see as the challenges, perhaps now, but also maybe on the horizon.
Yeah, I see a few, to be honest. The first one I see is actually the climate-induced displacement. And I don't know if you all remember, this is not a new problem. I don't know if you all remember the old song, "We Are the World, We Are the Children," from the 80s. That was about Africa and the starvation that happened in Africa in the 80s, where people were displaced, people crossed borders because of that. We have seen it in Australia with the bushfires. We've seen it in the States. We've seen it in Japan with the tsunami, Indonesia. We've seen people moving. But I think if we don't do anything about the environment, it will increase, and we'll see more of that. The other thing that I see, it has been going on for ages, which is war, conflicts. As we speak now, there is a war that's going on in Sudan that hasn't received any attention from the international community. People are dying, millions have fled, people are displaced within the country. Remember that Sudan is a home of over 1 million refugees as it is. So all these people now, they're all displaced. Borders have closed for Sudanese people. These people are living in the borders with no basic human needs at these borders. And I always say, like, if they don't die by a bullet or an explosion, they will die because of hunger and lack of medications. Orphans are dying in orphanages because nobody's taking care of them. They're not dying because the orphanage has been exploded or, there was an explosion there. They died because of hunger. This is wrong. As human beings, this shouldn't have happened. So yes, I think we need to pay more attention to what's happening. Like, as Tamara usually calls it, it's the invisible. Like, we know of some conflicts in the world, but there are a lot of conflicts that just we don't hear about them, and people are dying, people are suffering. And I wish just to shed light on the conflict of Sudan today. The other thing that I want to talk about is the rise of gender-based violence. I think, and to me, it's becoming a politics of degrading women. Like now the UN has issued the atrocity alert, I think, which is the use of sexualized violence as an act of war in Sudan. This is massive. This is big. And not just women need to stand up for this, but all of us need to stand against that. So this is what I can see now. That's gonna, we're gonna see more of it in the future, unfortunately, if we don't do anything about it now.
Yes, thanks very much. And your own background, from Sudan, it must be very real to you to see what the problems haven't gone away, though our attention might have shifted. So thanks for that. Ben, drawing on what you've heard, if there anything else, I suppose I'll say, because we want to move on to other questions too, but I'm very keen from your perspective, what you see.
I'll be very brief because I think Sarah and Zaki have again said it so eloquently. We do live in an age of displacement. This is an age of extraordinary displacement all around the world. The UNHCR estimates it's sort of upwards of 100 million people who are displaced. And the reasons are complex and they're often intermingled. It's often very difficult to be able to say this person or that group of people is displaced by one cause or by another. You look at something like the Syrian civil war, which might have displaced 5 million people in large part, and there were political and religious reasons behind that, but also in significant part, that was caused by a long-running drought in Syria and
Yeah.
skyrocketing prices of food and people being forced into cities. So there are often sort of complex factors that are exacerbating each other around displacement. I think, and it's been identified by other panelists, climate change is going to be an enormous driver of displacement in this century, and how the world responds to those massive movements of people is going to kind of very much shape the way our world looks in the next century. We're already seeing huge movements of people in lots of situations being driven by climate change, and often, I mean, it's often portrayed, particularly in this region in the Indo-Pacific, as sort of, you know, people talk about sinking islands in the Pacific and those sort of things. That it all sounds incredibly dramatic. That all of a sudden people wake up one day and they're displaced from an island that no longer exists. And it's not going to be like that. It's going to be slower, and it's going to in some cases be harder to recognise that these islands, these places are going to become gradually unlivable and less able to support the people who've lived there for countless generations, and people are going to be forced to move in that way. And so because it's a slower movement, it's a slower displacement, it's often harder to formulate policy responses to. And so I think we need to look at the way displacement looks and what those policy responses can be over a longer period of time, because it's not necessarily going to be one single event that causes people, but a build up over years and seasons and years and seasons. And just finally, I think Sarah made a really interesting point about which conflicts, which displacements we choose to pay attention to and the way we respond to them. And you'll remember that Australia initiated an additional resettlement of people displaced by the conflicts in Syria and Iraq, an additional sort of 12,000 places over a number of years. But we also instituted particular visa regimes for people fleeing the conflict in Ukraine. Where were those responses when 700,000 Rohingya were displaced from Myanmar? Where's that response to an ongoing civil war in Sudan? I think it's really reflective to look back and think and look at the conflicts we choose to respond to and the way we respond to those.
Yes, very sobering. Thank you. And just good to have highlighted, as all of our speakers have so far, the intersection of so many issues and problems. And you've also painted, you know, the long tail of all of this. Tamara, before we move on to the next question, I'm wondering whether you could offer any reflections on this. I'd like to come back later to, given the hugeness of it, you know, perhaps where we should be focusing, but is there anything you want to add?
Thanks, Julie. In a way, no, and in a way, yes, because I mean, really what I want to do is amplify all of the points made now. I think we're at a critical point in time in so very many ways here in Australia and globally. And, you know, we're really confronting unprecedented levels of unmet need and complexity. We really need urgent action, but very importantly, far greater global responsibility sharing and solidarity, because a lot of the escalation is to do with those pushbacks at policies of exclusion and how deeply embedded and entrenched they are in Australia and elsewhere in the world. And just, you know, to go to Ben's point around, you know, last World Refugee Day, we learned that we'd reached that grim global milestone of 110 million people displaced by persecution, conflict, generalized violence, human rights violations. We know that that figure has doubled over the previous decade, as has the number of conflict-affected countries. So in a rapidly worsening trajectory, the speed and the scale of forced displacement is dramatically outpacing solutions for people who've been displaced, refugees amongst them. So what that means is that, you know, most people who fled their homes remain displaced with their countries of origin. A small minority of the remainder find enduring protection in another country, but those left waiting often lack access to essential services, education, livelihoods, and they're disproportionately exposed to the ravages of food insecurity, COVID-19, escalating gender-based violence. It was termed the shadow pandemic by the UN Secretary General, the climate emergency, multi-layered discrimination. They're often separated from the mutual support traditionally offered to them by families and communities. So with those global megatrends converging, to go to Ben's point, they become threat multipliers. And so we do get the escalation, and we're deeply in that. To go also to that point around visibility, I think that is another major theme for us at the moment in terms of the challenges that we confront, that there is so much that we don't see, often by design. Sudan, Myanmar, Afghanistan, so many other places, which are sites of atrocities where cameras are no longer present or they never were. So that issue of visibility is a major challenge for us now. And in Australia, we continue to confront a microcosm of all of those challenges, you know. So certainly at Jesuit Refugee Service at the moment, we're seeing unprecedented levels of homelessness, gender-based violence, food insecurity, all of that. And a lot of that has been generated by design through successive policies of exclusion, even down to COVID, you know, people not having access to JobKeeper and JobSeeker. And then, you know, the more obvious and massive ones of offshore detention regimes and the rest of it. Thank you.
Tamara, I'm going to stay with you because we're moving on to, we've described the problem pretty fully. We want to touch now on actions that we could do. And of course, there's actions at an individual level and in our communities, and would like to explore that and with others too. But I'm going to add, I've already started getting questions from the audience, and we will be having more, but so I don't know whether you want to roll an answer into this.
Yeah.
What are the challenges and solutions to get the Labor government to implement its platform and to go further? And Zaki and others have commented on that. So I suppose there's action at an individual level, a community level, on what we could do. And I'm going to come to all of you, but just if I just stay with you just for 1 minute. Because that's the challenge, I think. What do we do about it? So if you could kick that off.
Thanks so much, Julie. Look, I mean, I think that one of the realities about working to persuade governments that have introduced policy platforms that look as though they're going to unpack some of the more egregious elements of our policy is that it's a very volatile environment in which we're working. So things are changing day by day, and the nuance of the strategy around advocacy actually can unfold quite quickly in terms of the specifics of what's being asked for. But what I would say is that CAPSA, Jesuit Refugee Service, JSS, Amnesty International, media outlets like The Guardian are actually excellent resources on the unfolding issues. But I think that what Labor needs to hear is that there is a critical mass of voting constituents who support a more compassionate and responsible Australia, and that we do not accept deterrence as an appropriate framework. We want Australia to exercise leadership globally. We want a fair and efficient, timely refugee status determination. We want to support refugees to rebuild their lives safely in the Australian community. We want a more robust and innovative refugee and humanitarian program, and we want an end to arbitrary immigration detention and various other things. So it is about just amplifying that narrative as best we can, but with examples of lived experience, sharing stories, countering the mistruths, all of that.
So Ben, I'm going to go to you. In fact, I realised just looking at my notes, I think this question was particularly for you. The same thing, but I suppose rather than focusing on individual and community actions, particularly, it's been recognised as perhaps a bit of a window of opportunity with a change of government. They have made some adaptations already to their policy frameworks, etc. Right now, in terms of a Labor government, I mean, I know that it's much more that we can do, but right now for this moment, what could we do more in Australia to get this government to go further?
You're right. Look, I do think there have been changes. You know, Zaki's talked about the temporary protection as a significant change, although a kind of unfinished change because there are still many people in that situation. I also think another significant change, and I don't want to say that it's everything, but the change in rhetoric has been really important. And there's a lot of a lot of these policies of deterrence, a lot of these policies, these sort of policies of extraterritoriality, of offshore detention, of immigration detention, mandatory detention, they're kind of based in a really harsh and aggressive political rhetoric. It's no accident that we don't have an immigration department anymore. We have a border force. We don't have asylum seekers coming to this country. We have illegals. All of that, all of those sort of language changes is incredibly powerful in changing the public's attitude and understanding about what it is that we're talking about. And so I think the fact that the heat has come out of this politically in terms of the rhetoric gives the government some space to kind of do these things. I do think there have been some really serious disappointments from this government in this area, in terms of it's a very cautious government. This is not, Anthony Albanese is not Gough Whitlam. It's not a crash or crash through government. They're going to take little sort of baby steps, careful steps to do what they can, without kind of upsetting the apple cart, or being seen to be sort of too dramatic, because sadly, what sits on the other side of Australian politics is this incredibly aggressive, incredibly vituperative rhetoric that they fear getting hit back with. And that was the Australian political experience throughout the sort of 2010s to 2020. That decade was this debate was just so fierce and so toxic that the politics forever poisoned the policy. I think the way people get to I'm talking roundabouts, but to get back to your question, the way people affect change here is through those traditional political levers. You write letters to your elected representative. You write letters and you go to the office of the immigration minister. You make your voice heard. You make the government aware that there is this great proportion of the Australian community. I'm not going to get into whether it's a majority or minority or whatever, but there is a great desire to see not just incremental change in the way Australia approaches the issue of asylum and refugees, but genuine reform. And as Tamara said, we don't start from a position of deterrence and pushback and hostility. We start from a position of international law. We start from a position of compassion and understanding. And I think if you can express that through attending rallies, through being, active participants in local community groups, and there are so many of them in all of the cities and all of the country towns all around this country, and just in sort of basic, on the ground civic action, I think that's the way we kind of change the conversation. I also think, just my final point, conversation's a really valuable thing. It's talking to the neighbours down the road that you might not get on terribly well with, who have views that don't align with your own, but just talking to them about the issue of displacement. These can be awkward conversations. They don't need to be hostile or aggressive conversations, but making it an issue that people who might not otherwise be engaged with this issue are obliged to kind of consider this and reflect on this and empathize around this is the way we slowly change. One heart, one mind at a time, sort of thing is the way attitude is the change.
So I'm gonna come to Sarah and Zaki about this topic in a minute, but while I've got you, and I am blurring the boundaries in that I'm getting a number of questions coming into me. So while I've got you, so people feel free to send your questions in now, but while I've got you, Ben, I'm going to ask you this about and in one way you've talked about it at a conversational level, having conversations, challenging narratives, etc. But a colleague has sent a message to me about around how do we promote a narrative of greater kindness and compassion, but also the question has come through about the media's role in disinformation. And so I've just given you're a media person, just going to give you 1 minute to say something about about how do we hold the media responsible too, or how can we get a shift there?
Yeah, no, look, it's a really good question. I mean, one thing I would say is talking about the media as a sort of monolithic whole is probably a bit difficult, because different news organisations approach this issue differently. And
maybe Ben, you could be the media. That would be good. Maybe we'll have you as the monolithic.
I mean, come the revolution. Anyway, look, I think what is my answer to that? I mean, I kind of, the free press is pretty sacred to me, and we need to be able to sort of speak freely about these things. But I do think there was a period in the Australian media where this was handled very badly, and those kind of tropes around queue jumpers and illegals and all of those sort of ugly tropes that we saw were kind of grabbed onto by the media and amplified, on the front pages of certain newspapers and those sorts of things. I do think we've moved past that to a degree, and I think again we are in this space where we can kind of invite the media, because the media should be a reflection of the communities it serves. Get in touch with journalists, who write stories you disagree with. Say, look, there's another perspective on this. I've got this story about this. As journalists, we're often very good at sort of putting information out, and we sort of, we sort of regard ourselves as sort of unimpeachable in that way. But journalists should be willing to kind of debate their stories, to be, emailed, to be phone called, to have people say, well, there's another perspective on this, and we shouldn't regard ourselves as the kind of arbiters of what's right and what's wrong.
I like what you're saying there, that we have responsibility back to challenge or to say, I've got a different perspective.
And I think social media and I think traditional forms of communication give you the chance to kind of discuss these things with journalists, and to kind of, nudge us in the right direction when we get things wrong. And I think, one of my consistent criticisms of the Australian media, and there are a few of them, to be honest, is that it often has a very short attention span, and the media cycle, dogs bark, caravan rolls on sort of thing. But I think to be able to engage the media long term, to say these are structural, systemic things we need to do, and they might not be, as we talked about, the kind of particularly dramatic news events, but looking at these issues in a more sort of systemic way can sometimes be hard to get journalists to kind of write on that. But that sort of policy interrogation, I think is really valuable.
Thank you. And I want to come to Sarah next about action. I'm just letting you know, though, audience, that in fact I have been embedding your questions in this. So it's not like we're just going to have a few minutes at the end for questions. These are your questions that I'm actually, as I say, embedding in the questions to our panel now. Sarah, actions. What actions could we, maybe if you focused also at the individual and the community level, I'm interested in hearing that, but feel free to go as broad-ranging as you like.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I think it's very important that we humanize the situation. When talking about refugees, it's not a topic. These are real human beings. These are real issues. So we need to humanize the situation before we act. And we can do a lot, and remember that a person doesn't just wake up on the day and I've decided to be a refugee today. There is a lot of trauma and sad events that are behind the scene before a person crosses borders to seek asylum in other countries. I am aware of time, but even from my own personal experience, I had what you can call the best life. When I was little, I never thought that I would ever leave my country. But then that's probably for another time, because I know that we don't have enough time to go through that. But I think what you can do, as I said, you can do a lot. You can get to know a refugee, a refugee family, get to know them at a personal level. Be generous, give your time. Donate your time. You can donate money to help refugees. Write to your MPs. Social media is a very strong platform. And I think I would like to quote Rosa Parks here and say that to bring about change, you must not be afraid to take the first step. We fail when we fail to try. We fail when we fail to try. And I just want to send a message saying that, please, if you're a parent, talk to your children. If you're a teacher, talk to your students. These are the future, and we need them on our side. And to those who tell you that we don't want refugees, they need to go home, please tell them that they would if they could.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And Zaki, I want to come to you now, and I'm not sure if this is fair, but I want to roll in a question as well that's come, which is about action. And, we're talking about personal or community group level, but a question's come in about how we can push for greater international collaboration as well. Now, that's at a whole other level, and if you would rather, depends where you want to answer, and others might do it too, but if you feel you can tackle that one, be very interested in your response as well. But the question is basically about action. What can we do?
Yeah. Thank you. I think it's a really good question in relation to the current crisis. I think Ukraine crisis was very unfortunate that happened and displaced millions of, people, children, women. It's a beautiful country that's, suffering now significantly. But I think that has changed the narratives when it comes to refugees. We were seeing a different race coming into the refugee world, unfortunately, and that sort of changed people's perceptions toward refugees. And it showcased that refugee could be anybody. Doesn't matter where you're from, what's your nationality, what's your color, and where you're from. I think we have to, reflect that in how the world has responded to Ukraine. And I think that sort of changed the whole perception. Even in Australia, how Australia mentioned that responded to the Ukraine crisis very differently to the Afghanistan and Africa and Myanmar. But I think we have to take that opportunity within our family, within our friends, as that has been mentioned before. We need to humanize the issue. We need to talk about refugee. We need to find different terminology. For example, newcomers. I'm not an expert in the language and how we can describe our new friends, but I think we need to keep having this kind of conversation about humanity, love, and caring for others, and reflecting to the current crises that are unfolding. If it's in Ukraine and Afghanistan, I think if we don't talk about it, the more we ignore it, the more we stay silent, the more this issue, as it has happened in the past, will be weaponized against those that are fleeing persecution, against our friends that are need of protection. So I think everybody can make a difference, and I think the way we measure difference depends on how we see it. But I think those conversations needs to be in our dining table. Those conversations need to be in our coffee catch-up. Talk about the crisis, to your friends, as Ben mentioned before. We need to talk about them as a human being. As Sarah said, they have families, they have friends. They're just unfortunate that their countries are going through violence and they need to find safety. But I think, again, we need to talk to our politicians to respond to the crisis that are unfolding and bring it home. Myanmar is a great example. It is in our region, and Australia has a moral obligation to respond to the crisis. So I think we need to reflect, what is it that we want to see, when we want to go to the international stages, how Australia should respond to the crisis. It is a humanitarian crisis. It's not just refugee crisis. I think that's something that we should reflect to our politicians and to our friends as well.
I think that's an excellent point. Sarah, did you have your hand up? Or were you just waving?
Yes, no. Yes, I did. I just want to add something. It's about a video that I've seen a few days ago that it was surfacing on the internet. I don't know whether you saw it or not, but it really shook me, that video. It was of a young boy. He appeared to be a North African, maybe 15, 16, maybe 17. This boy threw himself in the Mediterranean so that he can go to Europe. He tied empty bottles around his waist so that he can float. Maybe he didn't even know how to swim. I don't know. So as he was approaching and he was coming to the shore, crying, probably tears of joy, tears of sadness of what he left behind, tears of disbelief that he actually made it. I don't know what the tears were about, okay? But he was crying and crying and crying, coming, taking off the bottles. And then I see Border Patrol, and they're shushing him away. Go back. He looks behind. There's nowhere to go back to. I didn't come back on a boat that dropped me. I floated. I swam all the way. Do you know what that means? Do you know? And for me, we need to really check our humanity within us. As a human being, you cannot treat another human being like this. This is wrong written all over it. And I hope that we are not silent about it. And each one of us do whatever it takes to help that things like this do not happen under our watch here in Australia as well.
Tamara, you feel free to go.
Thanks so much, Julie. Look, just a very quick contribution from me in closing. Again, just to affirm everything that's just been said by Ben and Zaki and Sarah around that issue of galvanising a global response. With the global compacts that I mentioned at the start that I'd had some engagement on, we're just coming to a big event, which is called the Global Refugee Forum, which happens every 4 years. And it's about the implementation of the Global Compact on Refugees. One of the really important things about the two documents, Global Compact on Refugees, Global Compact on Migration, is that they state very unequivocally that what is really required to uphold human rights and to strengthen refugee protection is a whole of society approach with people with lived experience at the centre. And that in part is because governments, states are demonstrably not upholding their international commitments, and a whole of society approach is required. So around the Global Refugee Forum, one of the big things is that there are pledges, and they're pledges that are invitations for different countries, organisations, community groups, corporations to sign on to. And so that is actually an opportunity for galvanising a global response, because there is a lot of content there and there is a lot of input from donors with deep pockets. And so there are opportunities in that space. Another thing that's associated with the Global Refugee Forum is a database of good practices and promising practices. So through that, you can find community. Through that, you can find ideas for scaling up and replication and bringing together communities. So I just wanted to affirm that, and also to the issue of the visual. I mentioned before, you know, that situation that there's so much that we don't see. One of the things that I think happened over the last couple of years is that we actually started to see more footage of people responding at the grassroots level. And so that was things like, you know, footage of people leaving prams at train stations for fleeing parents to retrieve, footage of, you know, people rescuing their neighbours from rooftops in tinnies amidst the floods, you know, in northern New South Wales and elsewhere. So I think we can build a sense of community and solidarity and opportunity by sharing those things as well, and talking about those things as well as the extraordinary contribution that people with lived experience of displacement are making day in, day out as leaders within their communities and contributors to the societies in which they're living. Thank you.
Thanks. We're coming towards the end, and I'm just, you know, some particular themes are really jumping out at me. I really liked it when it was said, you know, this is a humanitarian crisis, not a refugee crisis. And I think the importance that's been placed today on humanising and personalising and making these stories real, which of course they are, having lots of conversations about it and at different levels, as you said, with family, at the barbecue, with work colleagues, all of these things which we can all do. We can take responsibility for finding out more, but as you know, different people have said, there's hope too. I suppose I feel at the beginning, I have to admit, I'm thinking, oh my God, this is pretty bleak. But of course, we have to stick together. And as recalling Rosa Parks, I think I feel encouraged by that too, that we all can take action. So we're going to put up a slide about action that we can take. But just before we do, I just want to mention one thing, because I didn't really introduce CAPSA at the beginning, which is the Catholic Alliance for People Seeking Asylum. And because I think I assumed that those here, you know about it. But I wanted to mention it because this is co-convened by JRS and Jesuit Social Services, and many, you know, this is our 10th anniversary. And when this grew out of the fact it was a cruel era, as we has been mentioned, And we knew that there were lots of, parishes or individual schools, kids taping their lips up and sitting in cages and actively trying to draw attention to the cruelty that was there. So we knew there was a lot of action happening on the ground. And as Tamara said, with people with lived experience at the heart of that, leading that. And we wanted to amplify that voice. And we also wanted to speak up for decision makers too, to say more about that, because we were concerned that, Catholics, like the rest of the population, have the whole mixture of views, and we shouldn't. We shouldn't actually. We should be going back to gospel values, to human dignity, to Catholic social teaching. And so we wanted to do something to galvanise what, is a fifth of the population, or people who identify in that way. So I say that because it is really about those stories on the ground and amplifying, and it is also about our action that we want to take out of this. So we're going to put up a slide and just give us a time to pause think about what action we can take away, really decide something today from this, or something else that you're going to do, that I'm going to do. Let's all just take a moment. So I hope each of us has identified something practical that we're going to do. It could be on this list, it could be something else. Now, I just want to go back to the panelists for a final word. And of course, you're all deeply experienced on this topic. So it's probably not a new thing that has come to you today, but I did want to just ask you each only a word or a phrase. We've only got, perhaps, 30 seconds to a minute each. Even though you are deeply experienced and like this topic isn't new, is there something that has come out of today that you feel, has touched you, or you really think, I think it's that we should be focusing on more? Is there something that you would like to leave us with? And I'd like to go around the panel. I'm going to start with those and finish with lived experience. So I'm going to start with you, Zaki. Is there something that, out of all your experience, I know, but today that you've heard that you think maybe that's something we could really focus on?
I think we're living in a very complex environment, and there's a lot of crises, and I am mindful of reflecting on people around and the conflicts that are unfolding. And I would like to apologize to Sarah that I've not mentioned Sudan, and it is a massive conflict that is unfolding and displacing millions of people. And I think that's something that we have to go away and reflect, that how many people are displacing around the world. It shouldn't be just Afghanistan or Myanmar or Ukraine, but we have to be mindful of other conflicts as well. When we talk, we should be inclusive of everything that is happening in the world. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Zaki. That's a really important reminder. Thank you. The invisibility of, but yet the ongoing suffering and struggles of many people. Thank you. Ben, anything in particular standing out for you from today?
Look, I think, there's been a lot that stood out to me today. It's been an extraordinary discussion, but I just think, and Zaki alluded to it then, empathy. I think empathy is something that I think is missing from our public discourse, from our political discourse. We don't just see it in this area, we see it in so many parts of our kind of our society. A willingness and an ability to sit down with someone whose experience we don't know and to understand their position and to empathise with their position, I think is a really valuable skill in all forms of life. And I think if we can find a way, in our own hearts to be a little bit more empathetic, to be a little more understanding, I think that will go a long way.
I think that's fantastic. Thanks very much. Tamara?
Thanks, Julie. Look, I think inclusion, truth-telling and hope are really important for me out of today. And I think the global theme for World Refugee Day this year was hope with the tagline of a world where refugees are always included. And I think that, you know, according to some psychologists, hopeful people tend to think that desired goals are attainable, even if their personal resources are exhausted. You know, they adapt, they persist, even when prospects don't seem favourable. And that certainly applies to so many of the refugee leaders with whom I'm privileged to work. And I think that one of the takeaways for me is the importance of moving forward when we don't have all of the answers with uncertainty, going to Sarah's quote. And I think knowing our own weaknesses and strengths, but when we act together, a lot of the challenges that we've been discussing become more manageable. So I think that togetherness, inclusion and hope. Thanks.
Thank you. And Sarah, last word for you. You're on mute.
Again? Okay, sorry.
It always happens.
Yeah, so two things for me, as Ben mentioned, empathy and compassion, to put yourself in the shoes of those who are less fortunate than you, and also hope, as Tamara mentioned. You know, when I see people coming here today, it gives me hope. It gives me hope that people still care. People want to make a change. So I thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I've found this really a rich discussion. I'm grateful to our panellists. Thanks to each of you, Zaki, Sarah, Ben and Tamara, and for sharing your insights and wisdom and experience. Thanks to participants in this webinar for taking the time, as Sarah just said, to show up, to learn, to listen, and we see it as a sign of hope that we will all take action. And please stay in touch with CAPSA. There are more activities going on in this National Week of Prayer and Action. Follow us, but we know that you are all doing a lot in your own lives, and I hope this has been a point of encouragement for you as well. So go well, and thanks again for participation in today's event. Bye then.